The holding cell at the 4th precinct smelled like industrial cleaner and old coffee. Vivian sat on the bench with her hands folded in her lap and her leather folder on the seat beside her. They hadn't taken it, which was either an oversight or an irrelevance, depending on how you thought about it. She wasn't making calls. She wasn't demanding anything. She was simply sitting, in the particular stillness of someone who knows exactly how this ends and is content to wait. Officer Dale Pruitt was not content. He was in his element and he was escalating. Back at the scene, while Vivian had been placed in the cruiser, Pruitt had spoken to the gathering crowd with the practiced confidence of a man who had never once faced a real consequence for his actions. He told them she had been acting suspiciously near a financial institution. He told them she had refused to provide identification. He said, loud enough for multiple cameras to catch, that this was standard procedure for someone fitting this description in this area. Someone fitting this description. For words. The crowd heard them. The cameras caught them. By the time Vivian arrived at the precinct, those 4 words had already been clipped into a 15-second video and posted to 3 separate accounts. Back at the station, Pruitt processed the arrest with unhurried efficiency. He was not visibly cruel in the way that shows up obviously. He was cruel in the procedural way, the way that looks like paperwork, sounds like policy, and feels to the person on the receiving end like being erased. He charged her with obstruction and failure to identify, which were thin charges, and he likely knew it. He noted in his incident report that she had been loitering with intent and had become verbally aggressive, which the videos already circulating online directly contradicted. But the report existed now, and reports have weight. He made her wait 3 hours before anyone processed her paperwork. When a public defender finally arrived, a young woman named Anaya, 2 years out of law school, Pruitt intercepted her in the hallway with a smug kind of patience. Your client's going to want to take the deal, he said. We can make this quick and quiet. Anaya looked at him. What's the deal? Plea to the obstruction. Community service. Done. She didn't obstruct anything. Pruitt shrugged. That's for a judge to decide. Could take months. Could be embarrassing. For her. What Pruitt did not know, what no one at the 4th precinct had yet thought to check, was that Vivian Caldwell had not made a single phone call since her arrest. Not to a lawyer. Not to a friend. Not to anyone. She didn't need to, because 45 minutes after the videos began circulating, a man named Gerald Fitch, senior vice president at Meridian Trust, had watched the clip on his phone, gone very pale, and quietly picked up his desk phone to make a call of his own. And the number he dialed was not the police non-emergency line. The first sign that something was wrong came through Pruitt's radio at 11:47 a.m. It was his captain's voice. Captain Rhonda Marsh, 15 years on the job, not easily rattled. But her voice on that radio had a particular flatness to it that the veteran officers in the room recognized as the sound of someone choosing their words very, very carefully. Pruitt. My office. Now. He went in expecting to be thanked. He had made an arrest. He had followed procedure. He had handled a situation calmly and efficiently, in his version of the story, which was the only version he had ever bothered to verify. Captain Marsh was standing behind her desk. She was not sitting. That was the first sign. Tell me about the arrest this morning. Pruitt told her. The loitering. The refusal to identify. The obstruction. The standard language, assembled in the standard order. He was calm. He was thorough. He finished and waited. Marsh looked at him for a long moment. Do you know who she is? A woman who was loitering outside. Do you know who she is? It wasn't a question anymore. It was a wait. Marsh turned her computer screen around. On it was a document, a property deed, dense with legal language, filed with the county recorder's office. She let him read the address at the top. It was the address of the 4th precinct. Pruitt stared at it. His brain began the slow, clumsy work of reassembling a reality he had not prepared for. That can't be. CW Properties LLC has held the lease on this building for 11 years, Marsh said. Her voice was very flat now. The city has been paying rent every single month to a holding company. That holding company belongs to Vivian Caldwell. The room seemed to get slightly smaller. There's more, Marsh said. She clicked to another document. Then another. The Meridian Trust branch on Callaway Street. The adjacent parking structure. The mixed-use building 2 blocks north where 6 small businesses operated, 3 of which were minority-owned startups that had received below-market leases specifically to help them survive their first years. Page after page after page. 40% of the surrounding blocks. Not inherited. Not given. Built property by property, over 2 decades of patient, invisible work. Her annual property tax contribution to this city, Marsh said slowly, is larger than our entire precinct's annual operating budget. Pruitt said nothing. There was nothing to say. The bank manager has been trying to reach us since 9:15 this morning, Marsh continued. He didn't call 911. He called the mayor's office. And at that exact moment, Marsh's desk phone rang. She looked at the caller ID. Something shifted in her face. She picked up the phone and said, very quietly, "Yes, sir." The story that emerged over the next 4 hours was not simple. It never is when the truth is this large. Vivian had grown up watching her neighborhood bleed. She had watched buildings go vacant and stay vacant. She had watched the city conduct study after study about revitalization while doing nothing. She had watched outside developers arrive with promises and leave with profits, taking the value with them and leaving the community with nothing it hadn't already had. So she had done something different. She had stayed. And she had bought. Her first purchase was a burned-out laundromat on Henley Street, acquired for $18,000 cash, her entire savings at the time. She renovated it over 6 months, working weekends, and rented it to a woman named Dora Sims who had been running a laundromat from her garage for 2 years. Dora's business, given a real space, tripled in its first year. Vivian bought the next property with a small loan. Then the next with revenue from the first 2. Each acquisition was strategic, patient, and invisible. She never sought press. She never applied for grants or entered competitions or posed for photographs. She simply worked and the portfolio grew. But here is the part that no one expected. Not the reporters who were now assembling outside the precinct, not the officer who had made the arrest, and not even most of the people who knew Vivian personally. It wasn't just property. When the city's pension fund managers began quietly pulling records that afternoon, prompted by a single question from a very senior administrator who had recognized Vivian's name in a news alert, they discovered that CW Properties LLC was not just a landlord. It was an investment vehicle. And the city's pension fund, through a fund-of-funds structure 2 layers removed from any direct connection, had been investing in it for 9 years. Officer Dale Pruitt's own retirement account had been growing, in part because of Vivian Caldwell. The irony was so complete, so perfectly formed, that it circulated through the precinct in whispers before anyone said it out loud. Meanwhile, in the holding cell, Vivian finally accepted a cup of coffee. She looked at Anaya, the public defender, who had by now checked her own phone 4 times in 12 minutes with a growing expression of disbelief. "You knew," Anaya said quietly. Vivian looked at her over the rim of the cup. "I knew who I was," she said. "That's enough. Why didn't you just tell him? Show him something? A business card? Because," Vivian said, setting the cup down with great precision, "I should not have to prove myself to someone who has already decided not to believe me. That is the exact problem. And I wasn't going to pretend otherwise just to make his mistake easier for him." Anaya sat with that for a moment. Outside the holding cell, somewhere down the corridor, a door opened and then another, and then voices began rising in a particular way that happens in institutions when something has gone wrong at a level that makes everyone simultaneously aware of their own exposure. The machinery was in motion now, and it moved fast. By 2 in the afternoon, the sidewalk outside the 4th precinct looked different than it had at 9 in the morning. There were cameras now. Not phone cameras, broadcast cameras, with satellite trucks parked at angles on both sides of the street. There was a small crowd that had gathered not in shock but in something more deliberate. People who had come specifically because they had seen the video and had come to see what came next. Gerald Fitch from Meridian Trust stood at a podium that someone had hastily assembled on the precinct steps. He was reading from a prepared statement, but his voice had the unsteady quality of a man who understood that his institution had stood by while one of its most significant business partners was arrested outside its own front door. Meridian Trust has a long-standing relationship with CW Properties, he read, and we deeply regret that this morning's events. Someone in the crowd shouted, "You stood inside and watched." Fitch paused, continued, "He was not having a good afternoon." Inside, Captain Marsh had made 4 separate attempts to speak with Vivian through Anaya, not to process paperwork, but to apologize, to explain, to offer something. Each time, Anaya had returned with the same message. Ms. Caldwell is willing to speak when she is released, not before. She was released at 2:34 p.m., not processed out slowly, not moved through the back entrance with minimum attention. Released through the front door, because Vivian had specifically requested it. She walked out into the afternoon light with her leather folder under her left arm. The same as always. The crowd reacted, not with cheering exactly, but with something that moved through the assembled bodies like electricity. A collective exhale of something long held. Several people began recording. Several others began applauding. An older woman near the back was crying, and she didn't look embarrassed about it. Vivian stopped at the top of the steps and looked out at the cameras. Have you ever watched someone stand in the middle of a storm and simply refuse to be moved by it? That is what it looked like. She did not give a speech. She did not raise a fist. She said exactly 3 sentences, in the same quiet voice she had used all day. I have lived in this neighborhood my entire life. I will continue to live here. And this building, she gestured behind her at the precinct, still needs a new roof, and I expect the city will handle that on schedule. There was a pause, and then the laughter started, real laughter, the kind that breaks tension like a window, and even some of the officers on the steps behind her couldn't entirely suppress it. But Dale Pruitt was not on the steps. Pruitt was still inside, and he would not be coming out the same way he came in. The formal consequences began the following week, but the informal ones had already started. The video? I should not have to prove myself to someone who has already decided not to believe me, had been recorded by Anaya on her phone during their conversation in the holding area, and once Vivian gave permission to release it, it spread the way things spread when they articulate something that millions of people have felt but never heard said so plainly. 48 hours after the arrest, Officer Dale Pruitt was placed on administrative leave pending a full review of his conduct. The review did not go well for him. What emerged was not one incident but a pattern. 17 complaints over 6 years, stops, detentions, incidents that had been filed and categorized and quietly shelved. A picture assembled itself, piece by piece, of an officer who had never been seriously challenged because the people he targeted had rarely had the resources to challenge back. Vivian had resources, and she had something else. She had documentation. 15 years of weekly visits to Meridian Trust, logged in bank security footage that was retrieved and time-stamped. Her car in the parking structure, time-stamped. Her meetings with Gerald Fitch recorded in his calendar. 15 years of evidence that she had belonged on that sidewalk every single Thursday, and that her presence had never once been a problem until one officer decided it should be. Captain Marsh appeared at a press conference and did something that police captains rarely do with genuine feeling. She apologized. Not to the cameras. She looked directly at Vivian, who was seated in the front row, and she apologized to her specifically and personally, and her voice broke slightly on the last sentence. The city's oversight board announced an independent investigation into stop and detention patterns across all 4 precincts. The pension fund, once the fund of funds connection became public, released a statement celebrating their long-running investment relationship with CW Properties and their confidence in its continued growth. The statement did not mention the arrest. The irony did not require elaboration. But the moment that broke through every defense, the moment that made even the people who had been inclined to defend Pruitt go quiet, came from an unexpected source. An elderly man named Robert Haynes, 81 years old, had been sitting on a bench across the street from the bank that morning. He had seen everything. He hadn't recorded it because he didn't have a smartphone, but he had written it down. In a small notebook in careful cursive, he had recorded the time, the conversation, Vivian's behavior, Pruitt's approach, the words, someone fitting this description. Robert Haynes had been a civil rights attorney for 40 years before he retired. He had seen this particular pattern so many times that documenting it had become reflex. He brought the notebook to Vivian's attorney, not Anaya, but a civil rights firm that had contacted Vivian the morning after the video broke. "Young lady," Robert Haynes said, when he finally met Vivian in the attorney's conference room, "I have been waiting 30 years to hand something like this to someone with the standing to use it." Vivian took the notebook from him with both hands. She held it like it was exactly what it was: evidence and also witness and also history. "Thank you," she said. And Robert Haynes, 81 years old, hands slightly unsteady, eyes completely clear, said, "Don't thank me. Build something." 6 months later, Calloway Street looked mostly the same. That was the point. The buildings were still there. The diner where Vivian ate on Tuesdays was still open. The laundromat that Dora Sims had been running for 20 years, in the space Vivian had renovated from a burned-out shell, was still humming on Thursday afternoons. What had changed was less visible and more permanent. The civil rights case settled out of court for an amount that Vivian donated entirely to a new legal defense fund for residents of the neighborhood who faced discriminatory policing. She did not announce the donation publicly. Gerald Fitch announced it because Meridian Trust, stung by the footage of its own manager watching the arrest through a glass door, had matched the donation and needed the credit. Officer Pruitt did not return to the force. The details of his departure were not made public, which was frustrating to some people and accepted by Vivian with the same equanimity she had shown throughout. "What matters," she said in the one formal interview she gave to a local paper, not a national outlet, "is the pattern, not the person." The independent investigation resulted in new oversight policies across all 4 precincts. They were imperfect. Implementation was slow. But they existed now, in writing, in a way they hadn't before. A Thursday morning when a woman stood on a sidewalk holding a leather folder and refused to make a powerful man's mistake more comfortable for him. Anaya, the public defender, filed a formal motion to have Vivian's charges expunged, which was granted in under 2 weeks, a speed that suggested the judge had his own feelings about the case. And Robert Haynes attended the expungement hearing. He sat in the back row and wrote in his notebook and said nothing to anyone. What strikes you when you look at the full arc of what Vivian Caldwell did, not just that Thursday, but across 23 years, is the extraordinary patience of it. She did not arrive on Calloway Street as a hero. She arrived as a child, and then as a young woman with savings and a plan, and then as someone who simply kept showing up, kept buying, kept renovating, kept renting to the businesses and families that the market had decided weren't worth the effort. She never sought the moment on those precinct steps. She never staged it. She never needed anyone to know what she had built. The knowing was never the point. The point was the building. And here is what that Thursday morning actually revealed. Not about Officer Pruitt, whose failure was ordinary in the most devastating way, but about Vivian. Real power is not announced. It doesn't need to be. The people who feel the need to demonstrate their strength in every room they enter are almost always the ones who are least certain of it. The people who are genuinely formidable, the ones who have spent decades building something real, tend to move through the world quietly because they already know what they carry. You will meet people in your life who are underestimated by everyone around them. You may be one of those people. The world will sometimes look at how you dress, how you move, where you stand, and decide in 4 seconds that you don't belong, that you're out of place, that you're a problem to be managed. And what Vivian Caldwell showed, not in a speech, not in a viral moment, but in the 15 years of Thursdays before anyone was watching, is that the answer to that is not loudness. It's not performance. It's not convincing anyone. It's building something so solid and so real that when the moment finally comes, the truth doesn't need your help. It arrives on its own. It arrives through paperwork and phone calls and deed records and a pension fund that was quietly growing because of you all along. Vivian Caldwell drove home that Thursday evening in her 10-year-old Volvo. She stopped at the diner on Calloway Street, not Tuesday, which was her usual, but Thursday because she felt like it. She ordered what she always ordered. She ate slowly. She left a good tip. On the way out, the owner, a man named Paul who had been running the diner for 30 years and knew Vivian the way you know the people who have been part of your landscape forever, said, without looking up from the register, Heard you had a morning. Vivian considered this. I've had worse, she said. Paul nodded. That was the whole conversation. She walked out to her car, put the leather folder on the passenger seat, and drove home through the neighborhood she had spent her life quietly holding together. Building by building, block by block, Thursday by Thursday, while the world looked the other way. The most powerful people in the room are often the ones who never needed to prove it. Remember that the next time you look at someone and decide, in 4 seconds, that you already know who they are. What would you have done in Vivian's position? Stayed silent and calm, or spoken up? Drop your answer in the comments.